All right, we are live. Roy, thanks for coming on the show.
Matic, thanks so much for having me.
So, I always do a bit of a quick intro, and I probably sometimes get it a little bit wrong, but I guess so. In your case, you built one of the most successful esports platforms and then sold it for millions. You started that when you were just 23. So,
Mhm.
that's pretty early. That's pretty interesting. And now, a few years ago, started your second business, raised around $2 million in funding, and it's just taking off like a rocket. I think you got close to or around 100 employees, and you guys are just doing some fantastic work. And you've done obviously a bunch of other things on the side. So looking forward to just chatting about all of this in the next few minutes, in the next hour or so.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for that. And just there was one small, couple small corrections. I don't know why it says 23. I was 22 when I started Real Sport, but that's pretty irrelevant. But that's splitting hairs to be honest. But just as an update, because I think it's always useful in these conversations to have a real transparency around where we are in our journey, so that when founders listen to it, they can see whether it's relevant to them or not. So we've raised 8 million in seed funding now with Connected. So it's a bit more on that side, but hopefully that frames it for any founders listening.
Cool. Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll get into a bunch of those details also later in the conversation. But let's just start at the beginning. So, 22, you started Real Sports. Can you give a little bit of background, like how that started? Well, like, yeah, how did that story start? Where did the idea come from? The first steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was studying my undergrad up in Nottingham, studying politics, and was always trying to do entrepreneurial things, trying to make money however I could. And I started to run some club nights and some events, and started running trips for uni students. I was running trips from Nottingham to Amsterdam, Nottingham to Paris, just doing various things. And I could see that there was an opportunity to just start building out more content online to support those activities. And we started building out tools to help students create content. And that was really, really interesting. And we could see lots of demand there. But at that time, no one really cared about the student market. No sponsors wanted to pay. And we just realized it wasn't really going to work. But we applied what we learned there to the world of sports and esports and gaming, a market which was seen as an ambitious audience, one which advertisers really loved and could really get behind in terms of sponsored content and creating things there. So we ended up developing tools to allow sports fans, esports fans, gaming fans to create podcasts, videos, other types of content, giving them tools to optimize that content for social, which is obviously really standard now, but quite bleeding edge back in 13, 14 when we took it to market. And we just got really fortunate with that. It was just when sports journalism was having a big renaissance on Twitter, and it was just after Twitch had launched, so lots of people using our tools for those environments. And it was just when every big brand was like, "Oh, something was going on in esports and gaming. Let's get in there." So we, bit of right time, right place.
Interesting. So there was quite a lot of innovation actually happening. That's always interesting to me because it's always like how did you know, podcast, Twitch, like all that stuff was, I guess, fairly new, as you said at that point. How did you actually know what to get into, or how did you decide which things would be smart to research and start working on?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a case of following the numbers, right? So I think really it started with a lot of SEO strategy, actually, and understanding, where people were looking for content, but content wasn't necessarily in the right formats and wasn't necessarily created in the right way to be discovered. And at this time as well, and it's so funny how quickly things change, but at this time, you know, every person and his dog who liked sports had their own sports blog, and they weren't getting any views, they weren't getting any traction. And we realized that we could just help with that content creation, help with standardization, help with discovery. We built a recommendation engine to allow people to get discovered in really more efficient ways, in that sort of environment. So we were hoovering up all of these smaller creators who had their own little blogs, own little pages, and just bring them into our environment. So it was really a mix of understanding based on search volume what was underserved, and then finding creators who are just making that transformation from wanting to be print journalists in their heads to being online
Mhm.
content creators. And again, it's such a standard format of content creation now, of course, but even back in 2013, people, especially within sports, were still thinking about print. And it was just at that time, that transition. So we were really educational, we were really informative, helping people make that transition. So yeah, a lot of right time, right place.
Interesting. Um, How and then so the thing obviously grew to one of the largest platforms in the world. What what was your growth strategy there?
So we had a mix of utilizing social very, very well because we had
Hmm.
layered in these optimization tools for social for that content early. It was always about distribution. And at this time, again, it was really before Facebook was as pay to play as it is now. And if
Hmm.
you created good content, you could go viral. We had multiple videos which cost us, a couple £100 to make in a really, really just, quick and dirty way. You could get millions of views. You could get mass
Hmm.
distribution. Also, at that time, Facebook groups, Facebook pages were so powerful. If you were posting just things in feed, you would maybe just get, X amount of reach. But if you were posting in pages, everyone who's a member of that page was getting notifications. So
Hmm.
a lot of social hacks at the time. Social was much more Wild West than it is now. Now it's so much more clear cut and formulaic from a performance marketing perspective, i.e., I put in X, I get out Y. It wasn't as
Yeah.
formulaic or actually rigid and in many ways controlled as it was
Mm.
as it is now. So that was a really big part. And then of course you just had a really strong network effect because all of these creators were then saying, come follow me here, come consume more of my content here. So lots of one to many distribution.
Fascinating. Yeah. See that was like 10 years ago or so. So
Yeah,
a very different landscape in social than it is today.
a hundred
Um,
percent.
it's really interesting. So you were 22, 23, like that kind of age. I guess a lot of social media was well new, but also it's more natural for you to you at that age. Like I guess the older you get, the less time you spend on social media, the less kind of natural it becomes. I'm curious, how did you? When I think about myself when I was 22, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Right? There's a lot of you're just well, we're always trying to figure out a lot of stuff, but I guess when you're younger, even more so. Were you always just the kind of person who would just like try things and just figure things out? Did you have any mentors? Where did you learn from?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And just on your point about social and being a native, I totally agree. Now I'm no longer a social practitioner by any means. A little bit on LinkedIn, but we try to employ people and connected now who are absolutely native to those platforms. And it's interesting because I see this with TikTok. I can see the amount of agencies that spun up in the early days of TikTok that were not TikTok affiliated, but run and directed by people who had grown up as natives. It's
Mm,
interesting
yeah.
because, who would understand a product better? A product engineer who's maybe developed 25, 30 products, or someone who's literally grown up, using a product so natively and understands it almost as in like, a secondary operating system to what's going on outside the digital sphere. And you can see like they get brought into TikTok to show TikTok how they've created viral content. I mean, this is more in the early days, but it's really, really interesting to see. So I think being a practitioner in social is absolutely key. And yeah, certainly it's beyond me now. And I think with the rate of innovation, the rate of change. How old are you, Matic?
I am 33.
33. Okay, so we're the same age. I think it's getting harder and harder for people in our generation to stay on top of those iterative changes. Well, I'll speak only on behalf of myself, but
No, for sure. I mean, I agree. Although I'm trying to work really hard to stay in the now, to stay connected with what's happening. Obviously, I think with every year it becomes more difficult because the rate of change is also increasing.
mm,
But also now I'm realizing when I look at some of my friends or acquaintances who are like 22, 23, 24, and they're starting business. They're starting like TikTok agencies. I'm like, man, I was not aware when I was 22. I didn't realize the assets that I had, right? Like the advantages that you have at that age. I was just not really aware of it. And now I see it as I'm a little bit older. I'm like, oh man, yeah, there certainly is that advantage of just really getting it.
100%. And I think back to your other question about mentorship, the tools and information available to young entrepreneurs now about how to build business, what you should be doing versus when we were 22, 23, is just night and day. I mean, if we look at the
Mm,
venture ecosystem and the tools available, whether it's SPV tools like Valban and Vested, whether it's tools for cap table management, all of these things that make the venture journey so much easier just weren't around like 10 years ago. And then obviously, being able to leverage AI to grow and everything. So I think it's an amazing time to be a young entrepreneur. Like, there's almost no excuse not to be an entrepreneur at this point, or at least give it a go, which I think is amazing. But I was lucky early on with a mentor. So one of our early investors advisors who was actually the brother of my co-founder, was an entrepreneur called Harry Hurst, who had, I'd known him for a long time, and he was a couple of years ahead of us in that journey. He'd gone to raise venture. I didn't know anyone who'd raised venture. I didn't know anyone who'd raised money at all.
Mm,
I didn't come from that
mm,
background. My dad was a bus driver. My mum was a primary school teacher. I didn't have any understanding of what was going on in that world. But having him as a real mentor to the business, just showing us what was possible, was really, really eye opening, and very, very grateful to have that exposure and just seeing that journey. He obviously went to build Pipe, which raised huge amounts of money and everything, but that was massively valuable. And then our lead angel investor was a guy called Nigel Ray. Nigel was the first investor into Domino's Pizza, Nutmeg, Simba, Vice Media, just an awesome investor. So I was very, very fortunate to have some very experienced people on both sides of the table that could educate us.
Okay, quick break because I need to tell you something. My friend PJ reached out recently because he's hiring a COO, and that's something that you might be interested in. So, PJ is the founder of Judge Me. Judge Me is one of the most successful or the highest rated Shopify apps of all times. They're based in London. They currently have 65 employees. They're growing fast. It's a profitable company. There's a lot you can learn in the COO role. They're looking to grow the company from 7 to 50 million over the next 6 years. And that's something that you can help them achieve. It's an awesome company, great culture, great team. You'll work closely with PJ. You'll learn a lot, and you'll help scale this company. So if that's something you might be interested in, I'll put the link in the show notes. And if the job description is still available, that means that the role is still open. So I encourage you to check it out. And if you're interested, apply. Now, let's go back to the episode. I talk about that a lot. Like the people around you, that really changes everything for you. Like especially if you don't come from that kind of background. Like for me, the same, right? I was born in a village. Like I had no idea what a business is, right? I literally now when I think about it, I was like 20, and when I thought about what's a business, I laugh about that. Like I just didn't understand it at all. And then yeah, I think for me it was the same. Like a few people in my life just completely changed my perspective on what's possible, like how you do something. So as you said, much I guess easier to access all those kind of things today, but still so important in my opinion to just surround yourself with the right group of people.
100%. And I think that's why podcasts like yours are really important as well, because it's, getting conversations out there and helping people understand what is possible, especially if they don't come from a background where that's taken for
Mm.
granted, and I think it's really important to amplify that.
One question. So one thing I noticed, so you said you were doing a lot of things, in your early years. You were like trying all sorts of business ideas, trying to make a little bit of money. One thing I noticed is like those types of people. I mean, first of all, they usually end up quite successful at some point in life because you're like you try a bunch of things already at an early age. You have like that entrepreneurial spirit. I think you often need to be also very creative or problem solver, trying to approach things in like different ways. Maybe trying to do some cheeky things that at that age or in those early days they're okay. Later on, maybe you're like, okay, well, we shouldn't do that anymore. I'm curious if you have any stories like that that you can tell now, like from those early days of your business. Either growth stories or just like things that you've done and they're kind of like cheeky, creative, but you had to do them at that time. I think the reason why I think it's important to talk about that because it's another one of those things that's not necessarily visible or not necessarily often talked about. Although then later, a few years, and maybe even at that point you wouldn't talk about it, but later, a few years later, it's like, yeah, we did that. It was fine. It was fine.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think to be entrepreneurial in many ways is to disregard the rules, because if you're trying to do something new, you're
Mm,
breaking down
yeah,
frameworks.
yeah.
That's natural in building something innovative is you look at a framework and say, well, actually, we don't need to follow that. So that, if that's your way of seeing things in life, then of course it's going to apply to other areas as well. And I think it's, no, there's no surprise then that there's so much like neurodiversity and dyslexia and seeing the world in different ways, within entrepreneurialism and ADHD, because it's seeing things in a different way. I mean, certainly for me, there were lots of things. Do you know, even if I look at my behavior at university, right? When I chose all exam subjects because I realized that actually to do well at exams, you just need to learn the formula for exams. Forget the subject. If you can just figure out how to build exams properly and do the
Yeah.
exam questions, you can get your 2-1, you can get your first just by filling in the gaps, really. So that was an approach for me that allowed me to not go to any lectures, but still get a first, get my masters and do all those things because actually you're playing the game rather than learning the subject in that way. And I think that's just, one of the things that you do when you figure out, okay, this is, if I do this, pull this lever, do this, I can make this work. So that's probably an example. But also, yeah, it was, did we always have, all the right visas for international students to, go on trips from Nottingham to Amsterdam? No, but we'll figure it out at the border. There's all those sorts of things that absolutely, you have to do when you're trying to make things happen. But I also think it goes to an impatience that all entrepreneurs
Mm,
as
mm,
well. It's just that, wanting to achieve things quickly, want to make things happen. And it's, yeah. And I also think maybe that sort of instant gratification culture that we live in now also really suits young entrepreneurs too. Again, that instant gratification. I want it now. I want to get it. I want to make things happen quickly. That's probably why this new generation is so entrepreneurial as well.
that's true. That's true. It's funny. I was the same at university. I didn't go to almost any lectures. I'm not necessarily saying I support that. Like, do your own, use your own judgment if that's a good idea or not. But
100%.
I just figured out how to do that better, and I did pretty well at school, right? Like I was a pretty good student. But I just figured out ways how to not be there if it was not absolutely necessary. And yeah, ended up well in the end.
This is it, right? If you figure out a system that works, you're going to use it.
Yeah, yeah. There's this funny story. I'm not actually sure if I ever talked about it before, but long story short, I was invited to go to a 1 month long trip to Brazil during the school year, right? And in order to do that, I would not be able to pass that year because I would just there was some lessons that we had to attend, and so I wouldn't be able to attend those for like 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks or something, right? So I just wouldn't pass the those requirements. And a friend of mine and we figured out a way to basically enroll in the same year of university again. So we passed all our exams, but we just enrolled into the same year one more time, which means that we were still students and we got like a bunch of like student benefits, but we didn't actually need to go to any lessons because we've already finished all the exams, right? So like we passed all the exams. So I was a student for 1 more year. I was able to go to Brazil. It was awesome. It changed my life. I talked about it. It was like one of the best things I've ever done in my life. Um, but also, kind of breaking the rules a little bit.
Amazing. That's it. So you were technically a student for a year, but didn't
Yeah,
have to go to.
yeah.
That's awesome. Love that.
Cool. Okay, back to real sport. So, what was it? 5 or 6 years later, you sold it for a multi-million pound acquisition, right? Can you talk
Yes,
a little bit more
exactly.
about that?
Yes, we sold it in 2018 to a company called Gfinity. Really, really interesting experience going from, small scrappy startup of sort of 200-ish people to being on the senior management team of a publicly listed company, learning all about quarterly results and the joys and pains of public markets. But a really amazing experience. So the CEO of Gfinity at that time, who acquired us, was a guy called Gary Cook. Gary was the ex-CEO of Manchester City and was there during their acquisition. He was on their board of Nike and the UFC, like really, really experienced sports guy. So it was very cool to learn from him and see, what it is to be a CEO at that level. And that was, again, we
Mhm.
talk about, seeing what it looks like at a different level and learning from that. So that was amazingly useful, really, really useful. Although Gfinity had its issues, for sure, as any company does. It was really amazing experience. And then I think, we had a year lock in, as usual. I was investing in startups during that year and really trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I think you have the typical post, whatever the exit looks like, if it's a good one or a bad one, that post exit identity crisis as a founder. Who
Mhm.
am I? What do I do next? Do I try, risk losing my track record by starting another one? Do I, do all these, various things that you go through? But yeah, it was an amazing experience, obviously life changing experience for me. But yeah, was an interesting one.
So you casually mentioned you had 200-ish big team. That's huge. I didn't actually realize that.
Yeah, so we had a good sized team. I mean, the thing with real sport is it was real passion economy stuff.
Hmm.
It was people wanted to be involved. So a lot of those 200 were, moonlighting. They're working their 9 to 5, and in the night time they're just working with real sport because we had communities. Real sport was a really community driven
Hmm.
platform, and we were probably covering 60, 70 esports titles, 60, 70 traditional sports, and you had these thriving communities. Some of these communities had 500,000 people in them. Some of them were massive. Like I remember the League of Legends community that we had, or the FIFA community that had. They were massive on there. So you had all these moderators giving, tens of hours a week just because they wanted to be involved, and real passion economy. You don't get that in many other industries. It's one of the things that makes sports really, really exciting to be with. But yeah, we had people all the way from California to Sydney because B2C sports, real time content. I mean, there's a lot of people, right? And it's an always on environment for sure.
Wow. Crazy. Okay. Nice. Okay. So then, um, then the identity crisis happens. Yeah, we've all, or a bunch of us have gone through that. For me, it was a slightly different story, but also gone through that after my first startup, which
Mhm.
was not a success, but it's kind of the same thing. You're like, oh shit, what now? Who am I? What am I supposed to do?
Exactly that. Yeah.
um,
Can I put myself through the ringer again? Right.
yeah,
Founder another
yeah.
time. Like, yeah, it's an interesting one. I say to founders that have had an exit either way, whatever it looks like, moving on to another project is it's very tempting, I think, from an ego perspective, to rush into the next thing, but you need to give
Mhm.
yourself a break, right? You need to just have a bit of downtime. Like, I'm not saying don't work, but like before rushing into, right, this is me, this is my next project. Try to give yourself a bit of a break because it takes a toll. That ego bruising takes a toll either way.
I actually remember now. So after my first startup, I actually moved to London right after that, and I remember at that same time, Travis Kalanick just left Uber, and
Mhm.
he immediately started his next business. And I remember thinking about it, and I was like, "Man, I got to start something immediately. Like before I even leave, like I need to have the next thing. It's like that's the way." And I put so much pressure on myself. Luckily, I don't know if that's luckily or not, but I did, and I actually got a job then for a while. Just took some time off, right, from the business roller coaster, and well, it was definitely less stressful. So from that perspective, it was definitely a good idea to do so. But it's just funny because you take like the most successful person in the world as an example, and like, well, he did it, so therefore the expectation is that I should do the same.
Yeah, 100%. And to be fair, maybe if someone turned around and say, "I will write you a blank check of 8 figures to get going," maybe it would be a
Yeah,
tempting
yeah,
offer. For
yeah,
most of us, that's not what the first day post exit looks like, right?
yeah. Right, and then connected. So that's your current business, right? Started in 5 years ago or so.
Yeah,
Four,
so
4 or 5 years.
so it's interesting. So I started working on it. So the story of Connected is after we sold Real Sport, I started investing in startups, and I could see with the companies that I invested in, the companies I was advising, that there was a very strong positive correlation between specific behaviors startups were taking and the outcomes they were having. And those behaviors were fundamentally twofold. One was the quality and frequency of their investor and board reporting, and then by extension, their investor and board relations. And the second was their ability to access expert networks. Neither
Mhm.
of these things are rocket science. I mean, that's pretty obvious, but it was amazing to see how many startups were actually almost overlooking those two things, maybe taking them for granted a little bit and not focusing and realizing how much they seem to predicate and interlink with success. So we started to
Mhm.
become really passionate about building out technology that would allow everyone in the startup ecosystem, so the startups, the investors, the advisors, the board members, to take part in these behaviors in as frictionless and seamless way as possible. So for the reporting part, we built out technology that integrates with a business's bank account, accounting software, and payment solution. It's the HSBC bank account, the Xero QuickBooks accounting software, the Stripe PayPal payment solution, whatever it is. We ingest all of that transactional level data, and then we auto calculate and populate that reporting environment. So that transparency they have with their investors, with their board members, all done for them. Because often founders don't even know what should go into those reports, let alone how to calculate them.
Mhm.
That's done totally on their behalf. They can share different levels of information with different types of users. Investors can get real time performance indicators into their venture portfolio in the same way they would with other asset classes. This allows them to help. Ultimately, I think many founders are a bit nervous by their angel investors, but angel investors know they're not investing in the perfect product. If they were, they'd be investing in Apple or whatever it might be, right?
Mhm.
They're investing to help and knowing there's going to be ups and downs on the journey. So that transparency piece, and I think the transparency piece is a reason why it's so linked with success. Transparency means
Mhm.
help
Yeah.
get ahead of problems. It also means you're setting up your team to be accountable, to focus on North Star metrics, all of these things that are really, really important. And for the second one, that ability to access expert networks, we realized we could use this data to help people find the right types of partners. So if your cost of acquisition is increasing, here's a performance marketing expert.
Ah.
If your engagement is dropping, if your product churn is increasing, here's a product expert. So we started building out networks of experts who can then engage with startups, offer their expertise, helping people to monetize their time in different ways. So we started building a very, very quick and dirty MVP in 2019. We launched formally in November 2020 on connected.com. So it's just been about 3.5 years now. And it's been really exciting growth. So we're servicing around 4,000 customers now, generating about 6 million ARR USD. So it's been a really exciting journey. And we just launched into the US end of last year.
Wow, nice. Congrats. There's a lot of things I want to talk about there, but maybe just to touch on the MVP, you said a very quick and dirty MVP. I think that's always interesting. If you can talk a little bit more about that, how you build it, what was it? Because especially myself, so I have a technical background, right? Technical people will love to over engineer stuff. Maybe not just technical, everyone, you're kind of afraid to launch it, you don't know if it's good enough, and then I think it's also very easy to actually build the wrong MVP, right? To not actually solve those right problems. So I'm curious, what was your approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm non-technical, right? So from my perspective, I am impatient from a commercial perspective. So I want
Hmm.
to start speaking to the market. I think I really see that in startup land, there's probably an 80-20 split between founders. There's like 80% of founders who are technical, who are super product focused, and they want to develop the most perfect products. And there's 20% of founders who are super commercial focused and they want to get into market and they want to sell. And there's no right or wrong, right? Both have their pitfalls, both have their pros and their
Hmm.
cons, and they'll have different bottlenecks and different stretch points. But I'm firmly in the 20% of really commercial founders. But I've always been blessed with great technical partners. So the way that I've always approached building my startups and side projects and various things is really MVP. And I think most people, especially in like a B2C environment, let's say, the quality of MVPs is such now that people are almost expecting finished digital products, in terms of MVP. So it is difficult. But
Hmm.
if you're in an environment where you can make sales or pre-sales, then the bare product is where I want to start, just to test that it can be commercialized, just to test there is market demand. So that quick and dirty MVP, we probably ran with it for about 6 to 8 months before taking
Hmm.
it away. And we had some customers, and we were probably around 10K MRR, nothing crazy at all.
Hmm.
But it was
Hmm.
just okay. People willing to pay for this concept. It's not perfect. We heavily discounted it. We were giving it away for £99 for the year or whatever it was to businesses. So it was really, really cheap. I think if you are going that route, you can't charge crazy prices. You're going to piss people off. So, we went low, but we wanted to test there for like marketing campaigns. Okay, is this the right messaging? All of those things, so that when we were going to invest in the next stage of the product, we were confident that we were going to be able to monetize it properly.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
ultimately, you are going to churn some of those early customers because they've had a product which is not ideal and it's not optimum. But if you've picked up a big enough market, you shouldn't worry too much about burning, an early cohort of customers, especially if you're being transparent. Look, we're trying with the MVP, we're trying these things, we'll give you massive discounts for life on the next one. So those early customers, some of which remain with us, they're on the same pricing of £99 a year.
Hmm.
Right. So, it's
Hmm.
that sort of, legacy that you want to have with them. But yeah, that's always been our approach to MVP, is get something that you can understand how you're going to acquire customers, understand what that sales cycle looks like, understand what lead gen looks like. Ultimately, everything is downstream for lead gen, and find the right technical partners. So For my MVP for this business, I worked with the guy Chris, who I'd known for a few years. We built something totally unscalable, right? It was
Hmm.
super
Hmm.
scrappy. And then once I had an understanding of, well, actually, this will be the requirements of the tech stack, I brought in a totally different CTO. And I was always
Hmm.
open with Chris
Hmm.
in the early days, saying, look, I'll give you 1% of the company, build this with me. Let's do it. You're not going to be my forever CTO in this sense, but you know what it
Hmm.
is. We can understand it together, and then we can hire the right CTO together, and everyone's happy. It's all about transparency.
Hmm. So it's basically it's a different skill set, I guess. Like somebody who's going to build something quick and dirty, and then somebody who's going to build something scalable, proper. Did you focus more? You said it was unscalable. Did you focus more on like the UI, the way how it looked like, so that the users felt like that was a finished product, but actually in the back end it was not like it was more scrappy.
Totally, exactly that. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, exactly that. And that way you can get the most learnings from, that user journey perspective and looking at, whether it be conversion funnels, onboarding, whatever it is, but in the back it just doesn't work. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm. Was interesting. I was talking to this interview with Jason Fried a few days ago, the founder of the CEO of Basecamp. Right, they're a really fascinating company. I love them as a company. I don't love the product as much, but
Mm,
obviously, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people do love the product. So they're just doing exceptionally well. And that was interesting. He said that they always, even now, so that's a company that exists for like 15, maybe 20 years or so. um, and even now when they start something new, they first just build the UI and they see if the UI makes sense, and if the UI makes sense, then they start building everything else, right? And they spend a lot of time thinking about the UI. He is a designer, so I think
mm.
that aspect is also just by nature important to him, which is oddly enough their software, in my opinion, doesn't have such a nice design. It's just unique. It's just different, right? The things that they do, they're just completely different. There's very um, independent thinkers, I suppose. Um, but yeah, it makes sense, right? For the user, that's depends on the product again. But for the users, that's all that exists, right? They just see what they see, and
Yeah, exactly. And I think everything should be downstream from demand. I think it is so
yeah,
with products that we think are amazing and that we love. And I know I've wasted
uh,
tons of money doing that, previously. But I think that's it. You've got to go downstream from demand. Because ultimately, product market fit, and it could be, feature market fit, however you want to see it, is a multi-year journey. It does not happen overnight. It's multi-year in terms of that shaping of product to market and to users, and it takes lots of goes to do that. But the only way to have those multiple attempts at finding that fit is through having individuals, customers, through the pipe to test it. So everything's going to be
mhm,
downstream from demand gen, because if there's no demand, you won't get adequate goes
uh,
at iteration to get to PMF.
yeah, yeah. Cool. So let's talk about growth again a little bit. So I think you said you're doing around 6 million ARR now. So again, built a company that's growing pretty fast. Um, Besides obviously building the right thing, what else was important for your growth this time in this company?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I think certainly the network effects that we've layered in have been really, really strong, because you've got founders or startups reporting to their investors. Investors can then say, "Great, I can centralize my
Hmm.
portfolio." So we only, and a founder's cap table, yes, could be London, but it could be San Francisco, Singapore, Stockholm, other cities that don't start with an S. There's lots of different distributions going on. So we only targeted marketing at the UK, but we
Hmm.
found by the
Hmm.
middle of last year we had paying customers in about 18 countries because of
Hmm.
that cross-border distribution. And ultimately, when you are building a network based around capital and expertise, although we're not a marketplace by any means, we're a SaaS business, but there is discovery within there. Ultimately, you don't have geographic sensitivity in the same way that if you're starting an Uber or a Deliveroo, it's a hyper
Hmm.
local market. Every time you've got that cold start problem of onboarding. But for us, if I onboard a performance marketing expert in Dubai, it's going to benefit a startup looking for performance marketing expertise in London. These are not things which
Hmm.
require geographic sensitivity now. They don't have geographic sensitivity in that way. So it's a real, real strong cross-border network effect, not just from distribution, but also in value of network. We add someone here, it's really useful. There's also lots of side switching. Founders become investors, investors become founders,
Hmm.
become advisors. So there's a lot of cross pollination in the network. So really, really strong from that sense, although it's taken a while, and we continue to optimize these growth loops and these these one-to-many interactions going on. But then obviously, LinkedIn is really important for us. SEO, we're the usual sort of
Mm-hmm.
distribution routes.
Mm-hmm. Um, how did you approach building your second company differently than your first one? So obviously, with the first one, you were very experienced, very inexperienced, very young. Took on a lot of lessons, I'm sure. Um, so, how is it different this time?
So many things, right? And I guarantee you, with my next one, I'll be like, "What was I doing with the second one?" It's a lifelong journey, I'm sure. Well, I think there's so many things different, but one of the biggest differences this time I'm a solo founder. Last time I had a co-founder,
Mm-hmm.
and pros and cons of both models. Pros and cons.
Yeah.
I think the way that we were co-founders was not necessarily amazing. We were both commercial founders who were running a co-CEO model, which was
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily fantastic. Although it was, but I definitely see the value of having a co-founder who is equitable with you, because you've got an equal soundboard. You don't have that
Mm-hmm.
when you're a solo
Yeah.
founder. Spitballing with your team is amazing, but again, different power dynamics, different stakeholding. Same with your investors. So I think that's a big difference in terms of the founder dynamic, and that's been a really interesting one to learn. So lots of it experience for me on that side. But I think relinquishing control quicker as soon as possible is probably the biggest difference. I think it's tempting as a founder to be like, well, look, I've got the right vision, I can make things happen in the best way, but just giving up control. And it was never about micromanaging, but just wanting to understand everything. You can't do that when you're trying to grow at scale. So certainly, we've grown much quicker connected than we did at Real Sport in terms of revenue. And I think a lot of that is down to just giving away as much control as is the right thing to do as quickly as possible. But so many different learnings, and I think B2C content very, very different to B2B SaaS. The environment that we're in
Yeah.
now. So
Yeah.
certainly lots of an experience and lots of things we're all doing wrong on a day to day basis, but trying to learn as we go.
People are very important in a company, right? And you've grown to, I think I saw somewhere on LinkedIn, around 100 or so team members, which again that's a pretty decent sized company already. I mean, for me that's huge. I've never run anything even close to that. um, how do you approach hiring? How do you hire the right people? I know that can be a big question, but I don't, let's see, maybe we'll dive deeper into it.
Yeah, it is a bit. It's definitely a big question. I think and those first hires are so important. I mean, it took us. So it was myself at the start of Connected. It took us 2 years to get to 10 people, and then in the last 3 years, because it was the first year was just me. In the last 3 years, we've gone from 10 to 100, right?
Wow.
So it's that sort of length of time to make sure you get those first initial hires, and it is a bit hire quick, fire quick for those first 10 people. If it's just
Mm-hmm.
not the right fit, they just have to go, and you're
Mm-hmm.
honestly better off, I think, going a little bit slower in terms of scaling to make sure you get those right 10 hires. Because ultimately, hiring for values, hiring for culture is easy to do when it's the first 10 people, because it's almost a reflection of yourself. As the founder, you are the values, you are the culture. But there's always going to be a 5% difference, you know, and that 5% difference will cascade and waterfall down with their hires. Your head of sales hiring their sales team, but if you're starting with a 10 to 20% discrepancy in values and culture, and that cascades, by the third round of hiring, you don't even recognize your company.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure you're almost as congruent as you can, not in terms of skill set or lots of other things, or diversity, or all those really important things, but in terms of values, culture. What does it mean to work hard? What does it mean for output? What does it mean for in terms of what we're trying to achieve on a month to month basis? You've got to be as congruent as possible for those first 10, because then yes, eventually you'll still get really far away from your hires, but it will be a much longer
Mm-hmm.
deviation, if that makes sense.
How do you check for the values when you're interviewing a person?
I think it's almost impossible to when you're interviewing. I think it's all about that first month of working together.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's brutal. I think it is brutal in the beginning of startups, and there will be people who don't make it through. But again, it's that transparency piece.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when you go from generalists to specialists, I see lots of casualties along the way. if you're not transparent with those first 10 hires. So for example, with my who's now my COO, who was my head of ops, it was always a conversation of, look, right now you're doing a bit of everything. Yeah, that's just the reality of being the first 2 3 people into a startup. But you need to start thinking about, well, as the business grows, what are you going to refine it? What is
Mm-hmm,
your
mm-hmm,
domain? Where are you going to be? Because I see a lot of early employees get, I don't want to swear on the podcast, but get screwed over by
mm,
founders because they don't have that conversation. And then, you get to Series A, and actually the people who brought you there, who, they don't really do anything particularly, they do a bit of everything, there's no place for them because actually now we need to refine.
mm-hmm.
So I think, again, just having that transparency early on, saying, look, I need you to do a bit of everything right now, but where do you see yourself? Where do you want to be? What can I support you to get to? Because then I think if you don't do that, you lose a lot of that early knowledge. And I see that's where a lot of startups get to trouble from a culture perspective, is they didn't retain or think about the succession of those early employees. They lose so much of that value, so much of that knowledge, so much of that culture, and it takes a long time if they can ever recuperate that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before, you said, what does it mean to work hard? And that's a question actually I thought about a lot in the past. These days, I don't know why I don't think about that so much anymore, but maybe I figured it out. I don't know. But
I'd love to hear your answer.
what, yeah, I was going to ask you first, like, what does it mean to work hard?
I think in the early days of startup, I think it's sacrificing everything you have to,
Mm,
and then from the minute that you don't have to, stopping to do it. But the
yeah.
first 2 years of startup, it's going to be zero work life balance. It's going to be brutal. Listen, I this is and this is not a good thing. Like you said before about the university example, this is not a value statement on this is the right way to do it. This is the way that I've done it always. Now, the first 2 years of both of my startups have signaled the end of a 6 year and a 4 year relationship, respectively. And again, that's not a good thing. That's probably a really bad thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's what I felt had to happen, or
Mm,
was that level of dedication and focus. I didn't feel like the end of relationships had to happen. I felt
yeah.
that
Yeah.
level of dedication and focus was required for it to move in the way that I wanted it to move. And I think I would never expect that of an early employee, ever.
Mm,
That wouldn't be right or healthy. But if you're a co-founder, that is, I think, the level that you need to go. So when I talk about co-founder relationships, it's alignment of alignment of effort, and alignment of outcome. What
mm,
do we mean when we say we're going to work hard to make this happen? And then what are we trying to build? Because if your end goal is a lifestyle business and my end goal is a venture backed business,
yeah.
it's totally different. So that's what I think is alignment on effort, alignment on outcome. But for early employees, look, you're a founder, you've got to realize that this doesn't mean anything close to what it means to you, to anyone else, and nor
Mm,
should it. But that's why you've got to take it on your own back and make the sacrifices necessary to get it through. Especially if you start taking money from people. If you're going to bootstrap
yeah.
it, then fair enough. Actually, you should go by your own pace. But if you're going to tell investors a story of we're going to do this, we're going to do that, you've got to mean it, right? Investors are human beings, and it's not fair to take money off people if you're not serious about trying to achieve something which is in line with their investment thesis.
Mm.
What's your answer on working hard?
What's my answer? Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, definitely, there's a few aspects I think to working hard, right? And for me, like the long hours and the sacrifices for me is the easy one, right? Because I don't know, I've always been the kind of person who works a lot and have some ambitious goals, and yeah, putting in the work. I think that's the easy part, right? Anyone can, or I think at some point you can make a decision. You can say, well, look, I am willing to sacrifice certain things for the others, right? Because you cannot have balance in all areas of life. Like you can to an extent, but one thing's going to be a little bit stronger, one thing's going to be a bit weaker, right? And maybe you go through different periods when you focus a bit more on your, you know, some areas of life, and then in other periods you focus a bit more on other areas, like you said, for a startup, right? In the first 2 years, it's just a lot of really hard work to get that going, to hire those first 10 employees who can also help you run the thing, build the culture, and then maybe you can chill a little bit, like take it a little bit easier. um but that sacrifice for me was always quite obvious, or at some point I just realized, I said, look, I am willing to, and for me, I sacrifice a lot of social life, right?
Mhm.
um and I tend to not socialize a lot, like in throughout most of the year, and then I'll take, like a week off when I'll just travel and like hang out with people, and I'll go a little bit more hardcore maybe in that 1 week or in those few weeks when I travel and when I take time off, right? But I'm not going to spend every weekday or every weekend going out and having beers and that was for me an easy sacrifice, right? I try to optimize my social life in a different way. um, I think for me, one important aspect of working hard was just also constantly going out of my comfort zone. So actually doing things that I'm uncomfortable with because they were necessary, right? And that was maybe making difficult decisions. Often it's making difficult decisions.
Mhm.
Um, or yeah, just doing things that I don't know how to do. And it's like, well, shit, I don't know how to do this, but I have to figure it out, right? Because I can't just wait and watch and hope. Like hopeful thinking, like wishful thinking. That's one of the worst things in my opinion. When you're just, well, maybe it's gonna get better. Well, yeah, but maybe it's not. So I think it's better if you do something about it. So I think for me personally, working hard, or in order for me to work even harder, a big part of that was being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And doing stuff that was hard, that was new, that was, yeah, that had consequences potentially. For me, that was a big one. And then I'm sure there are other areas of it as well. Yeah.
No, I think that makes total sense, and I love that, the being comfortable doing uncomfortable things. I love that. I'm going to steal that if that's okay. I will presently, but no, I think it makes total sense, and you're right. It's just developing that resilience,
Mm.
that I think you do by consistently training that muscle of being out the comfort zone. So I think that's an awesome answer.
Thank you. um, you mentioned, I think that was in one of your LinkedIn posts also, you said your mom came to, I think, England as an immigrant, and you said that had a big impact also on you as an entrepreneur. And I think that's potentially a bit related to what we're talking about right now. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, yeah. So my mum, she grew up in communist Hungary, in the 50s. Very, very hard life. I've seen where she grew up. I mean, it's the smallest place that you've seen. Six of them in there. I think they escaped in the 70s, I want to say.
Mm.
And then she ended up in Glasgow. And I always make this. My dad's from Glasgow, and I always make the joke. I don't know what was worse, communist Hungary or Glasgow in the 70s. It's pretty much a toss up there. But yeah, and my dad dropped out of school at 16, because he was heavily dyslexic, told he was stupid, bus driver, taxi driver, ended up going down the entrepreneurial route, varying levels of failure and success. And some years were good years, some years were really bad years. I mean, there was, I think when I was like 7, 8 years old, my mum was unfortunately diagnosed with cancer at the time. My dad had lost his business, and there was 2 years of there was no money coming into the house, and really, really difficult moments like that, which I think do also shatter the illusion of entrepreneurialism. It's not all
Mm.
roses and everything's
Mm.
perfect and up and to the right consistently. You see from a young age that, okay, there are these things. But I look at my dad, and he finally got his first exit at, I want to say, 68, 69 years old. And it wasn't a massive exit by any means, but it was a seven-figure exit and something, he'd finally got there. And that's perseverance, right? So I think,
Mm. Yeah.
and again, coming from very little, not even a high school education, because he dropped out at that age, and all those things. So you see resilience, and you grow up around that, and you see what it means to actually work hard, and to come through tough times, but also knowing, and I would love to get your view on this. There's one thing that I always say to myself, that I'm not going to die. I'm not going to end up in jail if this goes wrong. And
Mm.
if
Mm.
I can avoid those two things, I can always go again. And I
Mm.
think it's that, when you have that mindset, which is there is no failure. There's just going to be those hurdles along the way. So yeah, I think it's seeing the life that they had. Certainly, I think builds up that resilience and that expectation that whatever you want, you're going to have to work really damn hard to get it.
Mm. Yeah. I think one thing I often think about is just, I don't want to regret not trying my best.
Mm.
And I think I'm the kind of person who would really regret that. Or who does act, I do regret that often. If I know that I didn't try my best in certain situations, I'm like, fuck, why not? I could have, I should have, you know? So, I think for me, that's a big sort of driver, or, yeah, the reason that I do the things that I do sometimes.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
that feeling of that fear of like unrealized potential, right? It's definitely a big one, but I think I genuinely think that's the only attitude to have, because I think we have a very short term, on this planet. We have a very, very short, in the grand scheme of things,
Yeah,
opportunity, and it
yeah,
almost does feel like a waste. And
yeah,
ultimately, for everyone, you've got to find your peace, and the journey looks different for everyone. But
yeah.
whatever it is that you feel like you can do and give and teach and learn and all of those things, like, surely life should be about the pursuit of that.
Hmm. I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. So you just need to figure out what that is for you and how do you get there? How do you keep going in that direction, right?
Mm.
Um, what else? So you have ADHD, right?
Hmm.
And you said that ADHD was actually quite impactful for you in a positive way for your business success. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when I was 13, 14 years old, I was on the verge of being expelled from school because I couldn't concentrate in class. I barely came to class, as we discussed already, and was just, a bit of a nightmare, to be fair. I was. And was on the verge. I got involved with the wrong crowds, like all the usual stuff. And then got diagnosed with ADHD at 13 or 14 years old. And that was a life changing moment for me, because it allowed me to understand the right ways for me to work, understand, what hyper focus is. Also gave my school, and massive credit to my school for being understanding during that, but also allowed them to understand the way that I was working, and the right things for me. And that was a huge turning point. But I think where it's a real benefit for business is one of the, although seemingly counterintuitive, elements of ADHD is hyper focus. And the reason for that is, in the healthy brain, healthy brain, the task and focus modules of the brain fire asynchronously. In the
Hmm.
ADHD brain, they fire synchronously. And the way that we regulate those two modules to fire correctly is through dopamine. So, in high
Hmm.
dopamine environments, we go into focus. So,
Hmm.
entrepreneurialism, the highest elements of risk, everything's chaotic, everything's out the window, there's 10 fires at once, therefore massive dopamine release, therefore hyper focus. So actually, just the way that my brain is wired lends itself to being really focused in high pressured, high risk situations. And that's why, again, I think you see so much prevalence. So a guy called John, I can't remember his last name, I saw him talk recently at a Google event. He's the technical director of the CTO's office for Google. Super, super smart guy, but heavily dyslexic. He sits on the board of the British Dyslexic
Hmm.
Association. He told this amazing stat. It was a neurodiversity event run by Google. He told this amazing stat. The prevalence of neurodiversity, which includes dyslexia and ADHD, within the tech ecosystem is two and
Hmm.
a half times what it is of the general population. But the
Hmm.
prevalence of neurodiversity within the prison population is 10x what it is the general population. So it goes to show that that high risk, high reward, if not
Yeah.
channeled properly, can put you down a bad route. I think that's why, again, we need to talk about this, help people understand, because it's, if you're seeking high risk and dopamine and you're not in entrepreneurialism, who knows where you end up, right? So it's definitely a bit of a double edged sword, but if you can harness that, put it in the right places, entrepreneurialism is a good place to be.
Oh wow, fascinating. I had no idea. That's really interesting. Um, so speaking of hyper focus and just getting stuff done, I guess, what else is important to you to get things done, or do you have any routines or systems, or anything that's for you critical, or for you your kind of way to perform at your best?
100% time boxing. Time boxing for me is so important. It's the night before every following day, to-do list, time box.
Uh
These are all
huh.
the tasks, and it goes in methodically, because that's almost reducing, the strain on your working memory. It's
Hmm.
like you're free from it. You don't even have to worry about when are you going to do this, when are you going to fit time for it. You can time box it that way. Obviously, some days, things go out the window, but for the most part, that's really, key to me functioning in the best way possible. What about you?
Do you just kind of put, because I sort of do that, and I'll tell how I do it. And I've tried a bunch of things. I tried just putting stuff in the calendar, right? So I
Mhm.
put all tasks in the calendar, which is, I think, it's a really good exercise, because you actually see how much time. It's very easy to put 10 things on your to do, right? It's like, oh, I'm gonna do all of this today, and then when you put it in the calendar, you actually it visually shows how much time everything is gonna take, and then you realize you don't have 40 hours today, and you probably need to prioritize some of the things. It doesn't work for me though, because if I put tasks in a calendar, sometimes I'm just, it's like it's not an event. There's no accountability. There's no another person there. It's just not necessarily going to happen. And during the week, I find it difficult to time box, because I don't know, stuff happens. I do often time box my time on the weekends. For some reason, it's so much easier for me, because there are fewer interruptions. And typically what I do is I'll take Saturday off and I'll work Sunday. That's often my kind of schedule. And then Sunday I'll just have schedule for the whole day. I'm like, yeah, like 10 to 11 is this, 11 to 12 is this, and I just go, and that works. I'm just in the flow. That's like that to me. That's perfect. That's like I just go one after the other. I know how long everything's gonna take. And that works perfectly. But I'm
Yeah.
curious how exactly you do it. How
No,
does it
no, no.
work for you?
Do you know what? That's exactly how I do it, because I know that if I've got back-to-back meetings, actually those administrative tasks aren't going to happen. So I'm time
Mm,
boxing, for example, if I'm creating LinkedIn content. After
mm-hmm,
this, I'll happily do 15 minutes of LinkedIn content or like some video content, whatever it is. But if it's going to be like head down time, that's time box on the weekend. So it's exactly that. And it's, yeah, understanding and being realistic with yourself that if you're back-to-back meetings, like doing, an hour update on a business plan, for example, isn't going to happen. Uh,
mm,
yes, absolutely. The weekends are going to be much more focused, and I also do the Saturday off, Sunday working thing. But yes, if it's running around with meetings, video calls, like yeah, not much on the administrative side is going to happen. But I think it does give you an opportunity to I'll time box in. Okay, I'm going to check in with my COO. I'm going to give my head of sales a call, and we're just going to have a conversation about that. And even those sorts of things which are sort of not on the to do list, I'll try and
mm,
time box those.
mm. Another related thing that I've actually talked about in the past a bunch of times, because I think it's weird but also useful, is I often track all my time. So I'll use a tool like Toggle. Well, I use Toggle specifically now, and I just track what I'm doing throughout the whole day, right? And I'll usually do that for like a week or 2 weeks, a few times a year. And it just gives me so much insight into where my time is actually going, right? Because at the end of the day, not everything is on the calendar, or at least for me, it's not.
Mm.
um, and then I can look at it at the end of the week and I'm like, oh well, I spent so and so much time on this project and so much on this. That was not a very good investment of my time, or this was a great investment of my time. And then you can a little bit more systematically approach allocating your time differently, right? Because you can say, oh well, it looks like I spent a lot of time on this kind of task. That's actually not a good use of my time. It's very hard, for me at least, in the moment, it's very hard to be aware of, you know, oh shit, I just spent 2 hours on this thing. Probably shouldn't have, but it just, I don't know. I started and it took 2 hours, and it is what it is. But when you look at it at the end of the week, you can look at way more hours and way more tasks, and you can start seeing some patterns, and then you can just kind of attack the most important things. So I got that idea. I think I got that idea from Rob Dyrdek, who like tracks every minute of his day every single day. He's been doing that for years, and then he
Wow.
optimizes that. And I'm the kind of person, I realize that this is absolutely not for everyone, but I'm the kind of person who gets really excited about that. It's like, oh my god, that's cool. I
Yeah.
need to try that, and I did, and for me, I would say it was really impactful.
What's the name of the platform? Toggle. You say.
Toggle, yeah, Toggle. I think it's primarily meant for like freelancers and people who work per hour, so just a way to track your time. But if I just use it to track my own time and separate it per project, or sometimes I'll try to assign how much impact I thought, like how impactful I thought that task or that time block was. So that's been pretty.
Nice. I'll have to check it out. I'm saying so. For me, Whoop is the obsession at the moment with like health data and like breaking down everything.
Aha.
So I'll be all over that. But I didn't realize they had that type of platform for productivity in that way. So I'm definitely gonna have a look.
Yeah, cool. It's yeah. Well, I believe that time is your most important asset. So that's why I'm very obsessed about how I spend my time, right? And I think obviously important in business to spend time on impactful things, but I think just also important in life, right? Where did you want your time to go?
Mm.
Um, a similar thing that I've been doing for 10 years now, I think this is the 11th year, is at the end of every day, I write down just one sentence, maybe two, maybe three. What is the best thing that happened to me that day? And that's, I mean, partially you could say it as like good gratitude practice, right? Because every day you have to think about like every day there's at least one thing that was good, right? Even if you had a shit day. But what's more interesting then is at the end of the year, I'll review that, right? And then I see what are the things that I really like in my life. What are the things that I constantly repeat? I write two things to be more precise. What was the best thing that happened, and what was something that I didn't like, or that I think I kind of failed, or that I could have done better. And when I review that at the end of the year, I'm like, okay, so here are the things that I constantly fail at, or that I constantly hate or dislike, or whatever in my life. Now, again, you start seeing patterns, right? If I keep doing the same mistakes over and over, it's like, well, maybe it's worth me spending a few hours now trying to fix that, trying to solve that, so that I stop doing it. And the same on the good things, like what is the best thing that happened to me that day? It's like, oh, well, I really enjoy. I'll give you a specific example. I have a friend with whom we've known each other for like 10 years, maybe, and I really like speaking to her, but for some reason we would only talk like twice a year, maybe. And when I was looking at it in the end of the year, I was like, "Oh, it's always my highlight of the day when I have a call with her.
Mm.
Maybe I should do it more than twice a year." Then, you know.
Nice, nice. I love that. That's a good shout. I'm gonna start doing that. I'll be fascinated to see what are the things that are giving me negativity in life and see if there's a trend there. I mean, that's a really great way
There,
of
there
doing
usually is. For me, there are massive trends there. And again, on a day-to-day basis, you kind of don't think about it so much. You think about some of them, but about a lot of them, you don't. And then you see at the end of the year, and it's like, well, there's these four things that I just constantly don't like or don't do it in an optimal way. So
it.
it's worth spending like a week of my time, or maybe like thousands of pounds to solve that, right? If
Yeah,
that's going to impact my life so much.
yeah, that's awesome. That's great. We'll compare notes at the end of this year. I'll let you know what I'm cutting
Deal.
out. Hopefully, it's not like relationships or friends, but
Well, yeah, who knows, right? um, Good. Okay, so I'll have just a few more quick questions for you for the end. Is there any book or course or perhaps person that impacted your life, that had the biggest impact on your life?
I wouldn't say there's one which had the biggest impact of my life, but a course that I did last year, probably January last year, which was awesome, was Applied Network Effects, run by Samir Singh.
Uh huh.
Samir is an awesome angel investor. He was part of like Atomico's angel program. He advises many top, top VCs on network effects, and did his 6 week course on applied network effects. It was either last year or the year before, and unbelievable value, just amazing in terms. I think he now does that course on Reforge as well, which is a great
Uh huh.
platform. But
Hmm.
yeah, would highly recommend anyone who's looking to build a network effects or invest in network effects to hunt down Samir and get onto one of those courses and consume his content. Genuinely game changing.
Nice. Reforge. I love Reforge. I've done a few of their courses. Like really, really good. If you work on products like SaaS, any sort of technical product, really, really good stuff. Um, What's one skill or habit that's been the most beneficial for you in business?
Um, it's a great question. I'd say probably one thing is the realization that nothing is ever as good or as bad as it first seems. When
Hmm.
that email comes in and you're like, "Oh, it's the end of the world," or like, "Yes, we've all our problems are solved," is just tapering that and just knowing that it's your initial instinct gut reaction is going to be like either really great or really bad, but it's always
Mm,
somewhere in the middle. And I think
mm,
being able to just constantly have that reality check of like, okay, it's not as bad as it seems, or okay, might not be the opportunity we feel it is, and not getting swept away with the emotion that comes with that level
no.
of extreme positivity or negativity, I think is a really, really important skill for any founder to have to navigate this journey.
Yeah, it's that sort of mindset that we actually talked about before we started recording, right? With for problems specifically, I said, whatever problem you have, there's probably somebody in the world who wishes they had your problem. You put it a bit differently. You said if everyone in the world put all their problems on the table, you'd probably take your own problems back because they're still better than like a lot of the other ones. Um, and then yeah, when it comes to positive things, yeah, it's kind of the same. I realize with entrepreneurship, there's often these like massive ups and downs every day, every weekend. Part of the skill is just like trying to um, even those, like make the whole ups and downs a little bit more flat, so that you can actually sail.
Yeah, and this is it because in hindsight, actually that negative thing wasn't that negative, or that positive thing wasn't that
Yeah,
positive. And it
yeah.
because it always sort of balances out over time, right? So I think if you can appreciate it in that moment, that knowing in a week's time, well, actually it's not that much of a game changer either way. Again, there's just always ways to go through. Because I think if you start going into like manic mode or panic mode, let's call it, depending on the up or down, like the decisions you make around that day, things you might invest in, things that you might pull away from, like you can make crazy decisions based on emotion in those moments. So being able to contain them a bit more will actually have a big impact on your impact the rest of the day.
I agree. I agree. Nice. Cool. Roy, we're gonna link to your LinkedIn, the business, all your resources, the course that you mentioned as well. We're gonna link to that in the show notes. Um, Thank you for coming on. Anything else that we should talk about?
No, you're a legend. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. If you liked the episode, if you listened until now, please do share or leave a comment. So my mission this year is to get to the top 5 of most shared podcasts on Spotify, which I know is doable because we were in top 10. Top 10, right? The year ago. So please help me. If you listened, you're the only person who can help with that. Just share or just give the algorithm some indication that this is good stuff, and we're gonna get there together. So thank you, everyone.